Hey guys, Mrs. Karaz here. We have finally arrived at Chapter 5, The Road to Revolution. This is the big turning point where we're going to decide to make the move from colonies to United States, and I'm really excited to take this journey with you. We're going to start today with Section 1, Trouble on the Frontier. I'm going to say just bear with me. A lot of these things are going to sound complicated and like there's all these different things building on each other. That's about right, if we're leading towards a revolution. So bear with me. We'll connect all the dots together. Let's dive right in right now. Okay, so by the 1700s, France and England each controlled large areas of land in North America. And since they were both major world powers, England and France feared each other, right? One didn't want to be overpowered by the other. And they were also very competitive with each other. They wanted to outdo each other. Now, Native Americans lived on land owned by both the English and the French, right? And since there were fewer French settlers than there were British settlers, right, the French really didn't try to take too much territory from Native Americans. We saw in previous chapters that they were more peaceful in their interactions with Native Americans. So, we have a better relationship established there. On the other hand, the British have lots of settlers coming over, and they want more territory for these settlers. Gee, I wonder where that territory will come from. All right, so the territory that's in question here is the land in the Ohio River Valley. This is really valuable land because it has access to many waterways. It would be really easy to trade from this spot. And it's located in an area that just makes it really advantageous. So in 1753, the French start building forts to protect this land. They figure if our forts are on it, that means it's ours, right? At this time, the governor of Virginia sends George Washington, who right now is a 20-year-old member of the militia. And a militia is a group of civilians that are trained like soldiers, but they're not officially soldiers. And Washington and his men are supposed to tell the French to get off this land. The British want this territory near the Ohio River Valley. But the French refuse. They basically laugh him away and say, no way. Which takes us here. So Washington returns a year later after that whole conflict occurs. And he and his men decide to build a fort of their own, claiming the Ohio River Valley for the British. Now we have two different nations building two different forts. But we know the French started previously, right? And they built their fort first. They called it Fort Duquesne. But Washington said, we're going to build our fort anyway. They call it Fort Necessity, because George Washington was very original when it came to naming things. And it was just 50 miles away from the French fort. So obviously there's going to be high competition, there's going to be high stakes between these two world powers. So Washington's troops attack a small French force in this area near the Ohio River Valley, and the French fight back. This begins the French and Indian War. Now we have actual conflict occurring between Britain and France. So, let's move into the Albany Congress. So the Albany Congress was a meeting of colonial leaders, right? And again, we're seeing how there's some democratic practices in the colonies already, even though we're a part of a monarchy. So the British have asked the colonists, even though the colonists are British citizens, right, but the people living in the colonies, to join together and help defend against the French threat. And the British hoped that they could make an alliance, and an alliance is an agreement where two different people agree to help each other out, with the Iroquois, right, a Native American tribe in the area. But the Iroquois refused because they thought the French would win the war. They thought the French were stronger troops, and they also had better relationship with the French from their history together. So the Iroquois, let's backtrack, the Iroquois do wind up teaming up with the French, and that's why we call it the French and Indian War. It wasn't French versus Indians, it was us versus the French and Indians, and us are the British in that sense. Alright, so another Albany name thing, so this will be confusing. The Albany Plan of Union was written, and this called for a group of representatives to be elected by colonial assemblies. And here's what this group would do. They would control western settlements, right, land that is on the frontier. They would handle relations with Native Americans, okay, make sure that things were peaceful between colonists, British colonists here, and Native Americans when they could be. And they could organize army and collect taxes to help them accomplish those two previously stated objectives. So the Albany Congress approved this plan. The Albany Congress thought this was a good idea. But when they brought it back to the colonies to be approved in individual colonies, it was rejected. Because colonies wanted to stay separate at this part. They wanted to set their own taxes and control their own armies. Someone from Massachusetts didn't necessarily want someone from Virginia ordering their soldiers around, right? They wanted to keep everything within each individual colony. This will be problematic later, but we'll get there. Okay. So, we have a British military official. His name is General Edward Braddock. And he was sent to the colonies to help with the French and Indian War, right? We need someone experienced to help us defeat the French and the Native Americans. And Braddock was used to war tactics that were used in Europe, where you fight in formation in open fields, you march like in a straightforward way out to your opponent, and you defeat them and clear out there in the open. His men said, listen, that's not going to work here. We have a different fighting style. Things will be different. But Braddock didn't listen. So he marched his men wearing red coats. So imagine these like flaming red coats in the middle of a forest, right? They're going to stick out. He marches them in a single line on a narrow path to Fort Duquesne. And what do you know? It doesn't end well for the British. The French and Native Americans are hiding alongside the path. They are able to very quickly ambush the British and cause a lot of injuries. In fact, more than half the men, including Braddock himself, were either killed or wounded. So far, advantage French and Native Americans. All right, so this is going to get a little bit confusing. So now in May of 1756, Britain declared war on France. And this was the official beginning of the 7 Years' War, okay? This war included most major world powers at the time, although we're not going to talk about many of them. And it's important to know that the French and Indian War, which we've just been talking about, was essentially the name for the North American branch of the 7 Years' War. So if you think about... I want to give you guys sports references, and I know they're not going to go over well. So if you think about football, right, there's all different divisions in football, and I'm turning my computer to actually see what these are. But so there's the NFL, which is the National Football League, and then there's different subdivisions divided by region, right? That's kind of how the 7 Years' War worked. This is a terrible metaphor, but that's okay. I'm going to run with it. The 7 Years' War is like this, is like the NFL in this analogy. And then there's the AFC East or the NFC East and whatnot. I don't know what these things mean. I'm just trying to make a connection. And that is what the the French and Indian War. It was a smaller division of this bigger puzzle. I apologize for trying to do sports. All right, so let's look at some other people who played a key figure, who played key roles, and who I know a little bit more about than football. So William Pitt became the Prime Minister of Britain in 1757. And he wanted to send the top generals with serious military talent to help fight the French and Indian War. Because he feels if this is one of the ways that... the 7 Years' War started in ways in North America. Let's finish it there. Let's send the best people. Let's prove a point. James Wolfe just happened to be one of Britain's top generals. So he was sent to America, and his goal was to help bring an end to the French and Indian War. Let's shut this down. All right. So 758, under Pitt's leadership, the British capture Fort Duquesne, and they rename it Fort Pitt. And this and some other victories convinced some Iroquois tribes to start siding with the British. So Wolfe leads his men toward Quebec, the capital of New France at this time. There are 4,000 British soldiers, and they defeat 4,500 French soldiers, and they capture Quebec, which again was the capital. Without Quebec, France can't control most of its North American territory, right? Their capital has fallen. How could they expect to keep anything else? So this leads to, this among some other victories, leads to the Treaty of Paris, which is signed in February of 1763. This ends the 7 Years' War, and then it also ends the French and Indian War, because they're the same thing, really, right? So, since France lost, it was forced to cede or surrender many of its territories to the British. So, Britain gained control of French Canada, all of the French territory east of the Mississippi except New Orleans, and it gained Florida from Spain, because remember, those other world powers were also involved in the 7 Years' War. We just glossed over them because we're really concerned with American history and what was happening here on our territory. Spain, in the meantime, gained New Orleans and French territory west of the Mississippi. So at the end of the 7 Years' War, this is what we are looking at, okay? So everything purple belongs to the English, belongs to Britain. Everything green is Spanish. Everything orange is French. You'll see there's not much orange. And everything pink is Russian. We're not really talking about the Russian influence right now, but they're just up there around Alaska. So you might be sitting there saying, so what? Well, the big so what, right, is that A, we have all these conflicts that directly involve the colonies and what was going on in our land. This is going to influence us going forward. And now Britain has all this new territory. Look at everything that's purple that's outside of that original 13 colonies border, right? What are we going to do with this land? That is going to be a question that proves pretty tricky to answer. But we're not going to answer it today. We're going to freeze right here for today. And we'll talk about this much more in class. Have a great afternoon, guys.